Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Skill Up series session. My name is Emily Spranger. I'm a graduate learning specialist in the Graduate Studies Support Center. And we are very excited to have Dr. Sharon Kimmel and Dr. Marie Bakari today present Skillfully Maneuvering the Qualitative Interview Process. We are in a meeting format, so we would request that you stay muted unless called upon, and you're welcome to keep your camera on or turn it off. We are recording our session, and I will send you a copy of today's session, and we'll also post it in our Graduate Studies Support Center. And we want you to have conversation in the chat, so you're welcome to do that. But if you have specific questions, please put them in the Q&A function of our Zoom. That way it's easier for us to keep track of your questions and get to them as time permits. That's about all the housekeeping items that I need to discuss today. And we're excited to learn a little bit from Dr. Bakari and Dr. Kimmel. With that being said, I'm going to turn it right on over to you, Dr. Marie Bakari.
Pleasure to be here with everyone today, especially with my colleague, Dr. Sharon Kimmel. I am Marie Bakari. I currently am in the School of Business and Economics, where I serve as an Associate Director of Faculty Support and Development, in other words, a faculty coach or trainer. And I also serve as a dissertation mentor, and I do teach some courses. So I'm kind of all over the place, but very much into qualitative research, and I look forward to sharing with you today. Dr. Kimmel.
Hey, my name is Sharon Kimmel, and my experience, I've served as a senior research scientist for a large health network, about 12 years. I performed research projects with physicians and nurses and administration for about 10 years, and then transferred into oncology clinical trials research. I have been with North Central University, now National University, since 2013, serving as dissertation chair, faculty research block lead for the School of Business, which is how I met Dr. Bakari, and as an assessment director. I am currently serving as the director of institutional assessment. My PhD is in applied social research from Lehigh University in beautiful Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Today, as opposed to a typical we talk with PowerPoint presentation, we felt that the topic lent itself more to a conversation, such as maybe a podcast type format. Please note, this is not an interview style between Dr. Bakari and I. We originally wanted to mimic an interview by asking each other questions. However, as we began to prepare, we recognized that what we were doing was actually violating some very important interview principles that we wanted to talk about. For example, we're both very trained on the subject, and our intent is to talk about our experiences and gain knowledge. In an interview, both you, the researcher, and the interviewee will have knowledge on the subject, but the experience, perception, and knowledge of interest, the interview takeaway, if you will be only that of the interviewer. Wanted to also indicate that our assumption is that you will be performing a semi-structured interview for your dissertation, and we will predominantly use the term researcher for interviewer in order not to confuse it with interviewee, just to provide some sort of a distinction. Dr. Bakari, did you want to go through the 6 discussion points we will be addressing, or did you?
I'm happy to, actually. So today, what we'll be talking about is initiating the interview. We'll be talking specifically about listening, as well as interview focus. Dr. Kimmel will cover some topics as well, including questions, responses, and closing the interview. There will also be some time for Q&A, but we have our host who will also be monitoring the chat as we go along. So Dr. Kimmel, want to get started?
Yes, can we start with you, please, Dr. Bakari?
Absolutely.
Let's start with sharing your advice on listening for understanding. So how should a researcher listen during an interview?
It's a very good question, and thank you for it. I put a lot of emphasis on the word good here, just because researchers cover this topic and they've covered it for many, many years. For example, in a 2023 study by Levy and Ichikov, these researchers opened their discussion on listening by acknowledging that continued debate over the value of listening in a qualitative research is still going on. But in qualitative research, the emphasis tends to be on that interview protocol and how well, to say, the interview questions are formatted. Oftentimes, though, little attention is paid to the interaction between the researcher and the participants or the interviewees. So good listening can contribute to rapport, or the exchange and the relationship between the researcher and the participant. When you're paying attention to what someone is saying, you're listening, you can pick up on cues that where there might be information missing. So remember that the qualitative interview, semi-structured, is designed around a specific research question and within an identified framework. But these cues that you get from your participants can be opportunities to ask deeper questions. You can ask for clarity, or you can even ask for more information on what they're sharing with you. As a result, your interest in what the participant is saying, it can encourage that person to say more. This is how we get deep, rich data. I know you're familiar with those terms from your research and what the literature says on this. Listening in qualitative research can support the authenticity of the data at the end of the day. Keep in mind that when researchers report on the research process, say in chapter 4 or section 3 of an ADE, when they're reporting on this process, they do it just before they present the results. So if you review the dissertation template that you're using, you'll see that you have to address trustworthiness in the data. Earlier, I talked a little bit about the role of the researcher in qualitative interview, or actually I will talk about the role of the researcher in the qualitative interview. But if you think of the role of the researcher in qualitative research as a whole, the researcher is considered to be an instrument. That is, the actions of the researcher are just as relevant to the quality of the overall study as a survey could be to a quantitative study. Both are considered instrumental, and they are both instruments. So as your interview begins, you as the researcher must be intentional about listening. Are you listening for content or what is said? Are you listening for context, how it is said? The key takeaway here is that research is a process of discovery, and as the researcher, you can never forget that point.
That is so true. And I really like the point about active listening, because participants will talk candidly only if they believe that the researcher is interested in their story. And I love that you talked about the researcher being acting as an instrument. But what about, we all have biases. So what about bias? How does that play in to the researcher as an instrument?
I'm glad you asked that, actually. I would tell any qualitative researcher to include discussions about bias in their research plan. They should also include information about their positionality with the research and how bias might be mitigated throughout the study. We all think that we can go into a qualitative interview and not be biased, but yeah, we think we got it under control, but blink twice and ta-da, there it is. And it can taint your research, and if you're not intentional about controlling it. So consider there are several researchers out there with information on ways to mitigate bias. but make sure you write that into your research plan so that you have the guide that you need to mitigate your biases, or at least make a conscious attempt at it while you're conducting these interviews. I always like to state my connection to the research. It's somewhat of a declaration of how my person, my being, my interests, my education might actually impact how the results are displayed in the study. So it is important to state your connection to your research, whether it's something that you've personally experienced, whether it's perhaps even your connection with a particular group of people that sparked your interest in the topic. And like I said, this could be your profession, it could be your personal experience, it could even be your worldview. But nonetheless, it is worthy to declare that, because people who are reading your work, they want to know those things. They want to be able to make judgments about the quality of your work, and that figures into it. So be open and honest about what you plan to do to mitigate bias in your research.
So your discussion makes me think of the role of the researcher. And so, Dr. Bakari, what is the role of the researcher when conducting the qualitative interview?
Well, I'll tell you, the first thing I think about is ethics here, and what we as researchers are required to do by law. The big picture is presented to us in the Belmont report. And in fact, you'll all be familiar with it as you go through your CITI training. That is what is at the basis, at the heart of that CITI training, the Belmont report. Researchers like us have a duty to care, and we have a duty to protect the rights of individuals and institutions while we are pursuing knowledge. And also while we're pursuing data collection. So for qualitative researchers, this means you must respect the people and protect them from harm.
So how can a researcher address these ethical issues?
Well, there's several ways that this can happen in a research project. And keep in mind that when you look at qualitative research as a body of the method itself, there's several different ways to do things, but I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. Let's talk a little bit about data equity. You may want to limit the amount and type of personal information that you actually collect in your study. And I'm going to give you a set of questions that you should probably ask yourself as you plan your data collection. So, for example, what's the real purpose of asking for this personal information, such as dates of birth, or what income bracket you might be in, your race and ethnicity? What is the real purpose for asking those questions, asking for that information? And the next thing is, how will having that information affect your study? Here's another question. Will this information actually add value to the results that you're getting? What about asking, will asking this personal information affect the way participants respond to the interview questions? Okay, so that's just starting the idea of addressing ethics. That's one area. How about informed consent as a process? Informed consent is about telling the interviewees what to expect during the study. And it's basically a contract, and you're going to hear this word contract a couple of times, but it is a contract between you and the participants, right? Working with the Institutional Review Board. There's a tendency in the dissertation process to think of the IRB as just a process that you have to go through in order to collect your data. But every researcher who completes an IRB application and they go through that process and they are going forward with conducting their study, again, you are agreeing to a moral contract. Okay, so you're stating that what you said you were going to do in your proposal is exactly what you will do to collect your data. So consider it a contract. You want to carefully craft your interview questions. Now, Dr. Kimmel's going to talk a little bit more about interview questions later on, but your goal has to be to get information from the participants that they are willing to give you. Okay, so that element of coercion should not happen there. Paying attention to participants during the interview and looking for signs of discomfort or uneasiness. This is part of that moral contract. And remember, I mentioned this earlier, the more comfortable a participant is, the more open they're likely to be in their responses. So there's several ways to address ethics in research. The key thing is make sure you put it all down in your research plan so that everyone is clear on what your ethical position and plans are. So, Dr. Kimmel, I'm going to start with you now for a minute.
Yeah, I know you've talked a lot, but I wanted to know, did we want to take a little pause for questions? Sam, Emily, do we have any questions for Dr. Bakari before we move to?
Yes, actually, I have one question that has popped up, and you were just talking about this. How do you help try to ensure that coercion doesn't occur in the interview process?
Okay, so what is coercion? Coercion is I know you've all heard this term quid pro quo, right? Coercion is basically you have some sort of leverage that you're kind of exercising in order to get people to participate in your study. One way that this can happen, for example, is if you offer everybody who decides to come into your study and present data for you so that you can collect that data. If you offer everybody a $100 gift card, that can be considered coercion. I mean, who's not going to say something just to get a $100 gift card? That's coercion. Another situation where coercion can come in, you got to think about coercion as relative to power. So I supervise faculty right now. And if I were to tell my faculty, okay, hey, I'm doing this study and they need you to answer these questions, there could be the inference of coercion there because I'm their supervisor. So I have some power over whether or not they work, right? So you want to be careful not to put yourself and or the participant in a situation where that type of power can be exercised. Money is power. We hear that all the time, right? So offering that $100 gift card or me telling my supervisees that they have to participate in the study, that's coercion. Now, I'll give you examples of mitigating both of those. Let's start with the money thing. If you offer in your study a chance to win in a drawing a $100 gift card, that's quite different because, well, number one is cheaper for you, but think about the fact that they're willing to give it a go for the chance to win, as opposed to doing it because they're going to get that $100, right? Similarly, if I'm talking about the study that I'm doing and I want my faculty to be involved, the easiest thing to do there is to declare my power position and tell them, make a bold statement, whether you take this survey or not, to assure them that their positions are secure. Because then I have no leverage over them. Okay, I'm telling them, I'm taking that off the table. Take the study if you'd like to participate.
And also, as you go through the city training for the Institutional Review Board, and as you go through the Institutional Review Board, they will help you identify and eliminate any coercion that you happen to have within your study, because Dr. Bakari, sorry, I'm going to probably do that during the thing, so because we know each other. But Dr. Bakari had already talked about the Belmont report, which you'll become very familiar with, and which our institutional review board follows as a guiding principle.
Thank you so much, and for answering that question. And there's a follow-up here, so forgive me.
That's okay. Yes, there is gratuity. However, as the institutional review board will guide you, the gratuity cannot be greater than what that person would earn or acquire within the time allotted. I think I'm saying that correctly, and I really need to defer to the institutional review board, the IRB.
That's
So,
fair. That is fair. And I think it's best to have those questions addressed there as well.
Yeah.
And they mentioned, thank you for clarifying. Okay, we can, there's a few
Next topic?
questions. Yeah, next topic. There are a few. Let's do the next topic first, and then we'll come back for a few other questions that just came up in the Q&A. We'll do
Awesome.
next topic first.
All righty. So Dr. Kimmel, let's get into talking about the questions in the qualitative study, the questions that are used in the interview. What would you advise regarding developing these questions and using them in an interview?
So your questions have a major bearing on how useful your interviewee's responses or your data are likely to be. We all know that. And you, as a dissertation researcher, will come to the interview with a list of questions that have been developed in advance. We call that a semi-structured interview guide. And it's imperative that these are vetted by your dissertation chair and by the institutional review board. These second set of perspectives are needed to ensure that questions capture your intent, only your intent, to reduce the bias that Dr. Bakari had talked about, and to facilitate the interviewee's comfort, as well as protect their rights as a research participant. Again, this is in line with the Belmont report that Dr. Bakari mentioned. So when you begin your interview, be sure to begin with clarification and assurance that the interviewee understands the informed consent and is consenting to participate based on an informed decision. Participants want to know that they are free to express their opinion and, in some interviews, their emotions. So you need to stress the anonymity. I said it. Anonymity of the interviewer's responses. And the informed consent will also directly outline what is expected of your role and of the interviewee's role. So I know we've talked a lot about the informed consent. It's going to outline the benefit for the interviewee also, maybe, which might be a possibility of contributing, or maybe there are no benefits.
All right. Oh, thank you for that. And let's talk a little bit about the mindset of the researcher as they are working on developing these questions. What should the researcher keep in mind when crafting these interview questions?
Good question. The literature is very, very rich on how to word questions. For example, you have to develop open-ended questions, not closed-ended questions. That will result in a yes, no, or some sort of a trite answer. You need to avoid leading questions, and your questions should be short, direct, and non-offensive. The resource guide that Dr. Bakari and I will share will provide you with plenty of literature, as well as the literature that you're reading through your courses. Yes, of course, the questions need to be open-ended. It's to mitigate the ability of the interviewee to go yes, no. You need to be aware of leading questions again, types of questions that might impose your knowledge should be avoided or your perception. You need to remind yourself constantly that you're interested in obtaining the interviewee's shared assumptions of their knowledge of the topic, as opposed to validating what your knowledge is or what your assumptions are. Avoid questions that are worded that will lead the interviewee's response. You don't want the interviewee to respond in a manner of, this is what I think that you want me to say. You want them to be able to answer in their own words. So you need to assert minimal influence on their responses. Qualitative research is interested in gathering data around how people construct or articulate meaning around the topic of interest that's specific to the interview, or maybe even the world around them. So keep your questions on point. Beware of what we call double-barreled questions. These are questions that ask the interviewer to respond to like more than one subject or topic. This runs the risk of the interviewee focusing only on one part of the question and avoiding the other part or partially responding to the other part. So yes, keep your questions as simple as possible. Use familiar terminology for the topic. And also be aware of, how do I put it, highfalutin or like pretentious words. If you use these in your question to the interviewee may be off-put or feel the need to use high education vocabulary words. It is important that the interviewee is comfortable using their own words, their own vocabulary. So this means that you need to know the terminology around the topic, which you probably do because you've done a lot of research, completing chapter 2. And another consideration is, back to active listening again. Pay attention to the interviewee's words, to their terms, and you can also mimic and use these same terms and words. Also, allow time for the interviewee to reflect and pause. This is not a job interview. This is not an interrogation. So don't barrage the interviewee with question after question. Even though you have your list of questions, be very, very careful that you don't just ask the question, ask the question, ask the question. Be sure to pause, allow the interviewee time, and be sure to ask probing questions, which we'll get to in a little bit.
So all that said, we have this set of research questions. What can you share about the order of the questions? I mean, does it matter what order you pose these questions to an interviewee?
Yes, of course. And your dissertation chair will help you go through that. The flow of questions, of course, needs to make logical sense. But it may seem like a term, but let me talk a bit about authority and initiating the interview. So I already mentioned to begin the interview with the informed consent, ensuring that the interviewee understands, has sufficient information about the research, knows what's coming up. But you need to build authority at the beginning and throughout the interview through active listening, body language, your probes, your responses. By authority, I mean you need to give your interviewee the feeling that they have the authority to speak on this topic. You've probably heard about beginning interviews with icebreaker questions, and that's good as long as the icebreaker questions aren't too personal. These help to establish a rapport with the researcher. That's the intent of not getting directly into the topic right away, but establishing that rapport, because participants, they'll be more likely to talk candidly. I'm sorry, if they trust the interviewer and they have a good rapport, as Dr. Bakari had mentioned. This is good practice, but also consider using these icebreaker questions to impart authority to your interviewer. Use questions that acknowledge the interviewee's authority to speak on the topic and to provide meaningful information that will contribute to your better understanding whatever that topic of interest is. You can establish this sense of authority using some questions such as, how long have you? Or have you had other experiences with whatever the topic is? And just validating the interviewee's responses with your response, a nod of the head, an oh wow, something of that nature. I think this is important. I'm sorry, Dr. Bakari, but I think this is important because as a researcher, you've already gathered a lot of information. You've examined a lot of other people's research. You've done this for chapter 2 of your dissertation. You maybe have had experience with the topic, and you most likely have formed your own hypotheses and assumptions. But remember, the interview is a means to gather data, not a means to validate your knowledge or your assumptions. It's also not a means for you to let the interviewee know how much you know about the topic, which can be hard.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And one thing I'd like to add here, just to squeeze in this one little tidbit. We've talked a lot about the relationship between you, the researcher, and the interviewees, right? But consider that a lot of these interviews actually take place over Zoom today, as opposed to being in person. But there's still a lot that you can pick up on Zoom. You don't want necessarily, for example, to have a lot of background noise. That's the number one rule with Zoom meetings. But that background noise in your background can distract your participants, right? Your interviewees. And also pay attention to the body language, because you can still see so much on a Zoom screen, especially, I'm watching Dr. Kimmel talk and I see how enthusiastic she is and how thoughtful she is in her responses. I can pick that up over Zoom. So there's a lot that you can pick up as you're conducting these interviews. But I want to get back to some of the stuff that Dr. Kimmel was talking about. We've had this great conversation about the order of the interview questions and thinking through them. But what is the best time to ask questions that might be sensitive?
So remember that every question you ask has the potential to influence the interviewee's responses to the following questions. Take a second and third look at the flow of your questions in the semi-structured interview guide and reserve your more sensitive questions for about midway, or even a little bit later if you feel as though the rapport is not there, about midway through the interview, but not the end of the interview. This hopefully will give time for both the interview and the interviewee, or the researcher and the interviewee, time to relax, and establish a rapport. Remember, sensitive questions may make your interviewee feel vulnerable. It may make you're asking them for some emotions that sometimes they may not be quite ready to talk about yet. So be very patient. And this is especially the time that it's in important that you give time for the interviewee to reflect, to pause.
So what I hear you saying here is that, yeah, you can, you determine ahead of time where you put these sensitive questions, but is there a time in an interview where you might be able to reorder the questions, or you might need to reorder the questions?
Absolutely, yes. Research is a process of discovery, and you just can't let that go. Especially if the interviewee begins a response to a subsequent question or idea around the topic. You maybe need to kind of move back towards that, or active listening again. Maybe the interviewee has responded to one of your questions already. Just be careful that your questions are still in a logical order, that they're not all over the place, or you're not topic idea skipping, because that can get very confusing and convolute the data collection. It's okay to ask for a pause to check that all your questions were addressed. That's okay. You can be a human.
Well, thank you for explaining that. I'd like to pause here for just a moment. Emily, do we have any questions?
Yeah, most certainly, actually. There's several that have come up. So I'm going to try to, in the interest of time, get through some of them, and then I'll pause again and we'll try to come back to them. As we've been discussing the interview questions, a question that came up in the chat, what are your suggestions to obtain expert review of the interview questions to ensure that the questions are comprehensible by the participant? What are your recommendations?
When you go through the institution review board process, you'll be presented with the option of doing a pilot study or a field test. A field test would be where you can present your questions to people who are in the field or have experienced the topic of interest. And that is to me, that is imperative that you do that. However, you cannot use those people as part of your participants. So this field test is just presenting to them the questions and asking them to give you feedback around the question, not to respond to the question. Now, you could do a pilot study where you do ask the person to respond to the question. I recommend 2 to 3 persons who are already in the field, friends, colleagues. By field, I mean the topic of interest, experienced it, know about it, and maybe 1 or 2 qualitative researchers. Your dissertation chair, of course, will also go through it. If you do a pilot study, I believe you might need to go through an institutional review board. Dr. Bakari?
And that is correct.
Yeah.
2 things I want to add to this. Yes, if you're planning on doing a pilot study, you have to go through IRB and get approval to do the pilot study first, because essentially the pilot study is like your first run at doing the research. You're still working with real people, so informed consent and all of those goodies still fit into play here. The other thing I would warn about is that should you go through the IRB process and they recommend that you do some field testing or run a pilot, remember to go back and write it into your research plan, please. It is absolutely imperative, because this also adds to the authenticity of your research, that you took these extra steps to ensure that you got good quality data in the end. Emily, what's next?
Thank you. Back to a little bit of conflict of interest questions. We had 2 of them that came up in the Q&A that I wanted to make sure we could get to. They're similar. So one of them is that this person works on a college campus and they hope to utilize college student demographic in their study. Is this considered a conflict of interest?
Dr. Kimmel, you want to answer that one?
I think that I would have more questions about what the research is all around, or
Yes.
what it's about. I'm sure your dissertation chair can help you with that, because they know your research better than I know your research. But conflict of interest, you just have to. Conflict of interest is when how do I explain it in this kind of a situation? If you are a college student and you're using your college students' friends who have the same assumptions, background, culture than you, that may be a conflict of interest. Would you agree with that, Dr. Bakari?
I would. Because it's so easy, especially we talked about bias already. It's so easy for bias to creep in there because you know these folks, right? You already have existing relationships with them. So take great care there. But the other part of that question that struck me about using student data. First of all, if this is publicly available data, there may not be necessarily a conflict of interest, depending on what the topic is. But also accessing that data. Who do you have to go through in order to get that data? So, and how are you planning on using it too, by the way? So these are careful considerations that must be written out and carefully worked through in your research plan. So do take care with that, because as Dr. Kimmel mentioned, there's so many different little nuances that could come into play there. You do want to be careful if you're using that type of data.
And I appreciate that. The other question is kind of a follow-up about similar, but if you're not the direct supervisor of teachers, but you wanted to recruit former students or teachers from a school maybe that you used to work at, again, the conflict of interest question. And I think you've both mentioned that you would have to explicitly write that out in your proposal or your plan, but do you have anything else to add to that piece?
Well, I mean, consider who's in charge of that school district, who's in charge of the school. Those are the authorities that you're probably going to have to go through in order to access those participants. So do some deep digging, ask a lot of questions around accessing that particular group of participants, and get the skinny before you get too deep into your research plan and find that, oh no, this is impossible. And what we're talking about here really is feasibility. There's a lot of good resources in the dissertation center about feasibility considerations. Read up on that, because it's closely connected to the question, to that particular question.
Thank you so much. And then there's one more, if it's okay with both of you, there's two more in the Q&A that I'd like to get to.
Well, one second, Emily, because real quick. The conflict of interest question, there's conflict of interest that is related to research participants' rights, etc. And that's the informed consent, and that's the institutional review board. But some of this seems to be bleeding over into the conflict of interest of, and that may be my fault on how I responded. There's a conflict of interest in who your participants are. And you need to be very, very careful about, as Dr. Bakari had said, not only the power that you have over them, but you need to be careful about when you have participants and you know them well, they're going to, there's something called subject bias that can creep in, where they might be the cooperative subject who tells you what they think you want to know. And that doesn't help with your data because that just confirms your assumptions. There's another type of participant, which we all hope that they aren't our friends or colleagues, but they may want to intentionally sabotage your research. So there's subject bias that can creep in depending upon who your participants are. And I know I took a left and we need to go straight because of the time. Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. Would it be okay? I think this is a great question, and I want to make sure I'm able to ask it. And then if you need to move on to your next next topic, and then we can circle back to these other questions in the Q&A. But and this is fine if you want to get detailed or broad statements, but what makes a good qualitative research question?
Okay, that's a big one. Okay, actually, I think in one of our lower sections, one of the topics that we have planned to talk about, we're actually going to be covering a little bit of that.
Okay,
So
that's okay.
let's continue and we'll see
Okay.
how it goes. Okay.
Okay, sounds good.
All righty. So, Dr. Kimmel, I'm going to take it back to you. Can you talk to the attendees about responses?
Yeah, I can. Boy, and with that last question, I'm going to try to, mix them together. When, in an interview, you're looking for shared assumptions or contextual understandings. You're looking for common knowledge. The speaker's everyday life. It depends upon your topic, right? You want open-ended questions, of course. But the perfect qualitative question depends on your topic. How do you feel about? What is your experience with? It just depends on what your research topic is. But some of the responses that we talk about might also answer that. Not really sure. So let me see. I'm trying to think of how to best put this together. So when you ask questions such as, how do you feel about that? How do you experience that? And the prompts that you're going to use afterwards to get your interviewee to begin to speak a little bit more, especially if they're kind of closed answers, is you again recognize that the interviewee might need some breathing room. They might feel uncomfortable with the question. You might want to use a probe such as nodding your head, which is a silent probe. You just kind of nod your head or tilt it a little bit. You can echo the last or repeat the last statement that the respondent had made. You can maybe just do a neutral or you could even go into much more detail, like what we know: who, what, when, where, and how. I know that might not have answered everything. I think we're going to talk a little bit about long-winded. Sometimes you're going to find.
That's okay. No, that's okay, Dr. Kimmel. No worries.
Yeah. Like sometimes you're going to find some long-winded folks, and you don't want to interrupt them. You want to wait for a natural pause, like when they take a breath. Or you can just say, excuse me, and you can, again, go back to, the tell me more, just repeating the last statement that was related to the topic. Okay.
So now we get into this area. What happens when you get a response from a participant and you're not sure you understand what they were saying? What does the interviewer or the researcher do in those cases?
Again, active listening, again, a theme. So you want to, many of your probing questions will also be your follow-up questions. And these follow-up questions need to flow from the conversation and need to build on what the participant has already said. That's where your active listening comes in. You know, how they said it, what they said, and how they said it. You know, it's good to have a few prompts in your mind, like try to clarify that for me. Please provide an example of what you had said. I want to make sure that I understand this correctly. Again, what we had gone through with the probes of the silent tilting your head, the, you know, the neutral piece of it. And again, please give pause. It's hard sometimes. We don't like silence, but it's hard sometimes. Some of the techniques that I used to use to show that I was actively interested and that I was allowing time for the interviewee to breathe was there's a technique where you can try to use your facial muscles to pull the sides of your eyes back, and it tilts or it raises your eyebrows just a little bit, which shows interest, and it relaxes the rest of your face. And it also gives you something to try to concentrate on while you're waiting. So,
And I'm learning something here today. But that actually brings us to the end of the interview. What can you share with the participants today about closing that interview?
Real quick. Do not end on a difficult question. Please do not end. End on a difficult question. End on a positive note. Ensure that your interviewee leaves with a sense of contribution and that it was a positive experience. Please try to provide a sense of closure by saying, is there anything else you would like to add? Is there anything that you would like to ask of me? That's always a good, you know, gives them that closure as well. And in many cases, you will be asking the interviewee, don't forget, if they would be willing to review and provide feedback to the transcript of the interview. So real quick, we're running short on time. We wanted to talk about the focus of the interview. I think this is really important. So Marie, would you please talk about the interview focus? What's meant by interview focus? Uh-oh, I'm going to do double-barreled. This is a double-barreled or two topics. So what's meant by interview focus, and how can a researcher be intentional about the focus of their qualitative interview? And
I am fully prepared for that double-barrel question. So let me start by saying that an interview is not a casual, everyday conversation, right? It's intentional. It is much more intentional than that simple conversation. Basically, the interview focus is the whole point of the interview. Conducting a qualitative interview requires planning, preparation, careful selection of the participants, determining what type of interview to conduct. And today we're focused on the semi-structured interview questions, but there are other types that could be used in qualitative research. Listening, we've talked about that too. So there are lots of connecting parts to this focus, but at the end of the day, what is it that you're seeking? You're seeking information relevant to a particular topic, which is at the heart of your research. So when you're planning your interview, you'll have to think about 5 very important questions. Who, what, why, where, and when. Think about chapter 3 or section 2 of your ADE if you're doing an applied dissertation. That is your research plan. So when you're writing this proposal, basically this is what you say you're going to do. All the more reason to spell out in detail who your participants are, what you will be doing, why you will be doing what you say you're going to be doing, and where and when you will be doing all of these things. Your interview focus is shaped by different factors, as I've explained. For example, your research problem. What are you exploring? What are you trying to learn about the lived experiences of the people you're going to interview? It's shaped by your framework. whether conceptual or theoretical. Your framework is the lens through which you are going to be viewing and analyzing your data and then reporting out. How you will design your interview questions is a consideration Dr. Kimmel has shared with you today. And lastly, consider how research ethics and listening might factor into this interview focus. So these are the things that we'd like to leave you with today. I realize, yeah, we're really short on time. Emily, is it possible for you to collect the remaining questions and share them with Dr. Kimmel and I?
Yes, I actually just mentioned in the chat, if there are any questions that we didn't get to, please don't hesitate to email them at gssc@nu.edu. I would also like to point out, we do have 2 minutes. Dr. Kimmel, Dr. Bakari, is it okay if I ask one question that's kind of been looming around? So there's been questions about, you know, what makes a good qualitative research question. I think, and then there was another question about research questions. Can you talk a little bit about the difference of research questions versus interview questions?
Okay, you want to give this a shot or me?
I love this question because I've seen it in dissertations all the time. Your research question is an overarching question about your topic, and your interview questions, and I'm going to let Dr. Bakari do some of this too. Your interview questions gather the details, the data for you to answer your research question. Go.
Okay, so let's take rocket science, right? Big category, and you want to know something about rocket science. Well, what are those little questions that you can ask that will actually make rocket science make sense to you? And remember, the whole big part of qualitative research is making sense of the world we live in. So that research question, yeah, big umbrella, but what are the little questions we can ask beneath that will actually give us that big picture that we're looking for?
Very nice. Nicely said.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for explaining that, because I think we see that often. People have their research question and then they're like, these are the exact questions that I need to ask in my interview. But we're trying to understand what interview questions could we ask that will help us answer or inform our research question. And please correct me if I was wrong on that, because I'm still the novice. Okay.
Very good.
Great. I do want to thank everyone who has come as an attendee today. I want to thank Dr. Bakari and Dr. Kimmel for sharing their insights, tips, strategies for a successful qualitative interview process. Of course, there's not in an hour's time frame, we can't answer all of it. So if there are any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to our Graduate Studies Support Center or pose a question in the comments. We are frequent users of the comments. So if we see something in there, we will try to help guide you to at least point you in the right direction and support you. As always, we thank you all for your time. And Dr. Galveo, thank you so much for helping me keep an eye on things. We had a lot of students and staff and faculty on the call today. So until the next time, we appreciate you all and have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.